Good morning, British and American culture. Last class, we talked about imperialism and industrialization. So we are going to finish chapter 5. I discussed Ireland and the benefits and demerits of imperialism last class. So what I would like to do today is continue and sort of talk about the particular character of the Victorian period. It's called Victorian because Queen Victoria was the queen for about 60 years, and she left a distinct imprint on the 19th century in England, in the British Empire as a whole. Tomorrow we do have a quiz at 10 o'clock, so this lecture and the last one are the content that you need to prepare for that quiz. This is all of chapter 5. So first of all, there is a section right in the middle of the chapter talking about Adam Smith. Some of these sections are new, and this is new in the third edition of the textbook that I'm using today to talk to you. And so this is the first time in the history of this class, as far as I've been teaching it, that I'm talking about these subjects because they've just been added. So I've been studying for the last couple of years, preparing for this very lecture. So hopefully it's interesting to you. A lot of things about Victorian England and about British culture are connected to American and Korean and Canadian culture. It's kind of a, we talked about how the 17th century was sort of a transition between the medieval and the modern life. So this Victoria is sort of the connection between, the 17th century and us. A lot of things that we consider modern are actually no different than they were in the Victorian period. So the connection between Victorian society and us is very strong. Globalization was a key element to the Victorian, way of life. The connections between, far-flung territories. As I told you, some of those, relationships were negative and the not. In terms of, India or Africa or even North America, some of those relationships with England were very, stressful and negative, and didn't allow the full expression of those native cultures. So you can look at it from multiple perspectives. Basically, the Victorian period is a paradox, and we are going to talk about American culture for the rest of the term. We're going to focus mostly on America as the United States becomes a superpower. They go through the Civil War in the middle of the 19th century, which is next week's topic, and then as American culture develops into the 20th century, it becomes the most influential, the most important, the most powerful culture on the planet. And but there, at this point in the 19th century, it's the English culture that is dominant, that influences. It's a strange thing, really. It is a part of the whole paradox, is that such a small country in the northwestern part of Europe exerts such an influence on the entire world. So even more remote than England itself is the northern part of Britain, which is Scotland. And a particular individual, Adam Smith, comes up with this theory of capitalism, which the entire world has basically accepted as the way that economic systems now work. So to be, you can't disconnect anything from the influence of Adam Smith. That's why The Wealth of Nations is such an important work, because he outlines the most fundamental principles of economic relationships between individuals and systems and the global economy. So this is what he says. He says, the British Isles were the first nation to really fully embrace this commercial reality that things like insurance and borrowing and debt and investment and the value of the individual work can be floated in the marketplace, so that whatever you do, there's a market that decides how much that is worth, right? The market decides. It's not the government, it's not the church, it's not the individual or a guild who decides how much an item or labor is worth. The market decides. It's the invisible hand, right? You've probably heard this before. This is what decides how much something is worth, is demand, supply and demand, right? So if somebody wants something a lot, even though it looks like it's not valuable, like a piece of art, if everybody decides that piece of art is desirable and everybody wants it, it drives the price up. And if it's something that's not necessary or something that's not desirable, then the value is low. And that is how the economic system works. And this is a British idea. It comes from Adam Smith. So that's on page 164. But moving onward, I do want to talk about the things that sort of underpin the whole British system. Capitalism is one of those things, and that's something that eventually spreads all over the world and that all countries end up adopting, even the communist ones. Eventually they do have to participate in the international market, which is a capitalist market. But after the industrial process makes everyone focus on production and on supply and on the value of goods and the increased, flow of trade all over the world, simultaneously there is sort of a competition between countries, and it just like in the 17th century or 16th century, Spain challenges England's, England challenges Spain actually, and Spain tries to suppress the English and the Dutch unsuccessfully, and then they grow their influence and Spain declines. There's a similar contest between France and England of Great Britain in the 18th and 19th century, and everybody is probably aware of Napoleon's attempt to take over all of Europe and influence the future development of Europe by the French, and he fails, and a large part of his failure is due to the British resistance. Their British culture is not, it's part European, but it's an island, so they have some sort of distinctiveness that they try to remain a little bit distant, so they don't want to be intimately involved in the affairs of Spain, Italy, Germany, and France, but somehow they always get entangled in it. So in the end, the British are the ones that have to confront Napoleon, and on the field of Waterloo, the Duke of Wellington defeats Napoleon, and France is sort of returned to its natural boundaries and becomes a nation state that's not dominating, but just plays a balancing role in European political arenas. So the person who did that, the person who allowed the British to defeat Napoleon in Waterloo, is a person named Nelson, Lord Nelson. His name's Horatio Nelson, and in the book I spend a certain amount of time describing him, because I think he's just like Yi Sun-shin. He's a pivotal figure. He's a legend, just like Koreans remember Yi Sun-shin's defeat of the Japanese fleet, enabling Korea to resist the invasions of Toyotomi Hideyoshi in the Imjin War. That's a mouthful for a person who doesn't speak Japanese or Korean. But the Imjin War from 1592 to 1598 is one of the moments where Korea could have gone down a completely different path and become, a subject of the Imperial Japan. But it didn't, because of Yi Sun-shin. Similarly, there was a moment where the French, the power of the French in 1805 was so overwhelming that if they were able to transport the army across the Channel, that England would have had, the British would have had no chance of resisting. There was hundreds of thousands of French soldiers who were veterans of multiple battles and wars, waiting in northern France to be ferried across to the British Isles, but they were unable to do that. The Grande Armée ended up invading Russia instead in 1812, and that was a complete disaster. But just like other armies, the Spanish or Hitler, they were waiting, and if they were able to get those soldiers across that small channel, about 20 to 50 kilometers of open water, if they were able to get across there, they would be able to take over England. They were not able to do that because Nelson and his fleet were patrolling the ocean, and at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, they confronted the combined Spanish and French fleet and sank the majority of those ships, captured and sank most of the ships. Just like, Yi Sun-shin did in Myeongyang. That was an even more lopsided battle because there was only 13 Korean ships against hundreds of Japanese, but it's a similar result. Admiral Nelson gets killed. He gets shot by a sniper, and that's the end of his career, literally, because he dies. But his ship, the HMS Victory, and his fleet win the battle, and after that, Napoleon has no chance. His fleet is destroyed, and there's no way that he can invade Britain. So Nelson becomes one of the greatest heroes in British history. If you go to London, you can go to Trafalgar Square, and you can look up, there's a column with Nelson standing on top. He also had his arm blown off by a cannon and some splinters, so he's got one arm, and he's looking out, towards France in defiance, because he was able to stop Napoleon's invasion plans. So this is how I describe him in the book. Admiral Horatio Nelson was an amazing man with a tenacity and bravery that was unparalleled in his day. That's why he got his arm blown off, and that's also why he died, because he refused to hide. He stood on the deck and observed and took the risk that all of the other sailors and soldiers took, exposing himself to gunshot and cannon fire and splinters and everything else. Yi Sun-shin was the same. The reason that he, in the end, when he dies in Noryang, it's because Yi Sun-shin decides to stand on top of the deck and observe the battle and participate in the battle by shooting arrows and observing and risking his own life, just like his soldiers. And that's why he was so popular. He was so beloved by his men. Similarly, everybody loved Nelson, because he not only was he a brilliant commander, and they usually won when he was leading, but also he risked his life just like the regular soldier, and that made him, I guess that made him, if you were a soldier and you saw a general always avoiding battle and avoiding danger, you would think, well, he was sort of above you and not a member of the group. But that's not the way Nelson behaved. He was involved, and he was brave. He took a risk, and as a consequence, he died. His life was not without controversy, however, as he was stubborn. He had a flair for the dramatic. He had some torrid romantic relationships, and he was fiercely proud of himself. So he thought he was invincible. And I think Yi Sun-shin was the same too. That's the reason why they ended up being killed in battle. It's because they thought that they couldn't die. Even so, whatever you say of his character, what cannot be denied is that Nelson was born to be a great commander. He had unwavering confidence and he was incredibly brave. He led the British fleet to victory after victory, just like Yi Sun-shin, never lost. Likewise, Nelson undefeated. Insisting on being directly involved in combat until he lost an arm, and then he was mortally wounded for his involvement. His presence prevented Napoleon's extra-continental ambitions from being realized and set the tone for a century of unquestioned British superiority. So, in the book, there it is. That's the statue. It's quite impressive. You should check it out if you go to London. So he was so important that everything related to the Navy reflected Nelson's, style and his involvement. Okay, so for 100 years after that, 99 to be exact, from 1815 to 1914, there were no major wars. And that, again, this is one of the benefits of empire, like I described, is that the British controlled the sea, so no major world wars occurred from the end of the Napoleonic Wars to World War One. And we'll talk about World War One later. Okay, so that's Nelson's influence. So on the oceans, and there is basically no resistance. America is not powerful enough yet. Germany is still consolidating itself. It's not even a country yet. France has been suppressed and subdued. So basically, the British expand and they control the oceans, and they have a profound effect on India and China, because they are the major player, and there's really nobody else to challenge them. Once France has been defeated, for about 100 years, there's no other challenger until Germany becomes powerful enough to do that in World War One. So meanwhile, this Victorian paradox continues. This huge expansion, this global empire with so much money and these wealthy, important people. But at the same time, domestically, you have extreme poverty, and you have the effect of the Industrial Revolution. People selling their land, being displaced from their land, moving to the city and being exploited. This is the period of child labor. This is when small children are sent into chimneys to clean the soot and the dirt and the pollution out of very narrow, tall chimneys. And the only people that can effectively clean these things are small children. And whenever you think of an elementary school kid having a part-time job, you think that's illegal, right? But in this day and age, there was no such thing. There was no labor regulation. There was no, safety, rules in the workplace. there was no age limit or anything. So you could have 7-year-old kids dying or being injured, and wasn't legal consequences. There were consequences, obviously, because there was a high moral character in the Victorian period, and they expected, especially among the wealthy and the educated, that you would show respect for human life, and for proper manners and behavior and sexual conduct and everything else. But at the same time, there was a huge group of people at the bottom where these rules didn't apply, where they were subjected to the worst conditions and the abusive treatment, daily abusive treatment that we would never allow. We would never allow that now. So the people at the top, Queen Victoria and all of the aristocrats, the wealthy people, expected very strict rules of conduct and behavior. But meanwhile, all of the 99%, as we say, were exposed to terrible conditions on a daily basis. And this is what Charles Dickens wrote about. And when he wrote Oliver Twist, and he wrote The Christmas Carol, and he wrote all these other famous stories, he essentially is attacking the reality, the contradiction, the paradox of Victorian attitudes, where you believe that everything should be nice and everything should be friendly and everybody should be Christian and be generous and respect each other, but that's not how life actually was. And he I think, just like Queen Victoria, and she loved Charles Dickens apparently, she ignored a lot of the things that were going on. And that's part of the paradox, is that, on the surface, it seems like Victorian culture is very organized and orderly and well-mannered. Well, actually, it's probably worse than our society now. It is fundamentally a paradox. Jane Austen was one of these individuals who, Queen Victoria was a woman, but she wasn't really a person who promoted rights, women's rights. She wasn't in favor of, despite the fact, again, this is a paradox, despite the fact that she was the queen and she had a lot of power and she had influence herself, she didn't want women to have the vote. She didn't want women to be active and independent and individualistic. She was very supportive of the female domestic role, despite the fact that she was a widower and she was the most powerful woman in the world. She was against other women having a lot of power. Another Victorian paradox. So the fact that Jane Austen, she's one of my favorite writers. I disliked, I'll be honest, I took a class. I was a TA when I did my master's degree. I had to teach Jane Austen. It was an incredibly painful experience. My mother and my sister are huge Jane Austen fans. But the thing about Jane Austen is that if you read it and you try and get into it, so that you're looking at it you have to look at it from a female perspective. I'm a man, I'm not a woman. I don't know what it's like to be a woman, but if I read Jane Austen's work and I try to identify with Elizabeth or whoever the main character, Emma, or whatever the character is, and I imagine that that's how I have to be, and that's how I grow up, being sort of forced to take on this social role, then you can appreciate Jane Austen, right? She has a very sophisticated style. There's a lot of vocabulary. It's very highbrow stuff. And I always thought it was a little bit overdone. And but the same thing goes for Charles Dickens, right? He exaggerates the condition of the working, exposed child, and he even though he himself had 10 children and was not a good father by anybody's account, and so he was a hypocrite in terms of treatment of children and expectations. Great Expectations is one of his best books. If he had been reflective of what he was writing and he behaved the same way, you'd end up with a different sort of personality. I don't like Charles Dickens as a person. I love his writing because it communicates all of these themes about what it was like to be a Victorian person. And I think that's what Jane Austen does too. She nails it. She nails the contradictions, what women are expected to do. They're supposed to be pure and perfect. They're supposed to be sexual, and they're supposed to be virgins, and they're supposed to be prepare themselves and be educated and knowledgeable and ideal partners. But they're not supposed to be independent. And how can you expect somebody to be very educated and knowledgeable and skilled, but have no independence? It's another example of the Victorian paradox. And that's really, I think, the beauty of Jane Austen's work, is that her characters are all Victorias. Her characters are all Queen Victorias. They're supposed to be everything and nothing at the same time. And I think a lot of you are women, you're young women, and maybe you can identify with this too. That's part of the problem with Korean society now, is that Korean women are supposed to have jobs. They're supposed to be good mothers. They're supposed to be good wives and girlfriends. They're supposed to be pretty, but not, they're supposed to be natural. There's all this pressure from different directions. And I think this is a Victorian thing. This is a Victorian thing, that women are caught in between all these roles, and they can't satisfy all of them. It's impossible. Queen Victoria was a very depressed lady. She was very dependent on her husband, and when he died, after she had had 9 children, her husband died, and she spent 35 years wearing black and being depressed and mourning her husband, because I think that's what she felt like. Even though she was the queen and he was the prince consort, she depended on him too much, and society sort of wanted women to be dependent, and she followed that role as well. So Jane Austen, I know it's a difficult thing to read as a second language. It's obviously been translated into Korean, but all of you ladies, and men too, Jane Austen is an incredibly talented writer, and she gives you a lot of insight into what it's like to be a woman in Victorian society and in modern society in general. So I highly recommend, reading a little bit of Jane Austen, whether you're a man or a woman. So Queen Victoria, it's hard to underestimate how influential she was, because literally she had all these children, and these children grew up and got married to like every important person in Europe. So by the time she dies in 1903, I might be wrong about that exact date, but when she dies, her children and grandchildren are the leaders of the whole continent. She basically, her daughters and her sons marry, various people. The Tsar of Russia is her grandson. The Wilhelm, the king of Germany. It's not king. That's not the right term. But the leader of Germany in World War I, and the Tsar of Russia. Both of them are her grandchildren. They're all related to each other, and so genetically she has an influence. You know, her progeny spreads all over Europe, and they end up, you know, in the end, fighting on opposite sides in World War One. She died 1901, not 1903. That's my mistake. She was married to Prince Albert. She became, you know, a princess at a very young age. She was 18, and she affected basically all facets of British life. All of the things, it's basically because she lived so long that the whole period is called Victorian. But anyway, Victoria was a queen that was determined to retain political power. So it was not a democracy, remember. We've been talking about evolution. We talked all the way back to Magna Carta in 1215. It's always been kind of a struggle between the king and the queen and the people and the representatives of the people in Parliament. Although the monarchy had sort of deteriorated, because we talked about a couple weeks ago, America separated, and this caused sort of a slide in British prestige. The monarchy, King George III, King George, the Georges, and then King William IV. These three, there's about three kings in a row, are not very good leaders. And so the monarchy has, the value and the influence of the monarchy has been sliding. Meanwhile, the British Empire is getting more important, but the influence of the monarchy is declining. But Queen Victoria sort of, she sort of makes a comeback. She makes a comeback, and her political influence is stronger than any of the kings since Charles II or James II, way back in the 17th century. There hasn't been a leader as powerful or as influential as her for several hundred years. Okay? So, Victoria was she was a queen determined to retain political power. This is on page 178. Yet, unwillingly or unwittingly, she presided over the transformation of the sovereign's political role into a ceremonial one. So actually, despite the fact that she wanted to be more powerful, she sort of took a back seat to the leaders, the prime ministers, Palmerston and Benjamin Disraeli. There's a number of really significant leaders, and she sort of just supports them. So she's in the background as this powerful queen figure, but she just kind of approves everything that they do or disapproves it. She's like, no, don't do that. And they sort of listen to what she has to say, but this role of the king or queen starts to recede into the background. So it's not a democracy. She still gets to pick the leaders of the government, and she has a strong influence over those people, but she gradually starts to back away, especially after her husband dies. She starts to become less involved in the government. Basically, she just becomes a symbol, and that's what the monarchy is now. So again, Victorian culture has, a strong influence, and it's very closely related to British culture, especially these days, because that is essentially what the Queen is now. Queen Elizabeth II is an ambassador. She's a symbol. She's wealthy. She gets supported by the government, but she doesn't actually have an effect on policy, and she doesn't make decisions. She just represents British culture. And that's what Queen Victoria did. And that's what the monarchy is now. Queen Victoria's monarchy is what the monarchy is now. Okay, we're moving forward into the later part of the lecture here. So let's just finish off the chapter. The chapter at the end jumps back from Victorian England and goes back to America. And I think the reason I stuck this in the book, this is also a new section, it's because this is just like Charles Dickens. Mark Twain is probably the most important American writer ever. He's not my favorite. Personally, I like Edgar Allan Poe. It's a little bit of American Gothic horror. The way he puts things together and the way he writes so poetically. I love Edgar Allan Poe. But Mark Twain changed the whole landscape of literature. And since this is technically an English literature class, I don't really talk about literature that much, except for Charles Dickens and maybe Shakespeare and Chaucer, a few others in this class. We're talking about the big picture of culture, but one of the biggest things about America is that it's supposed to, unlike Victorian culture, it's supposed to be disconnected from class. And what Mark Twain does is he writes in such a way that it seems like it's a working class, speech. He writes the words, he imitates the way that we actually speak. And this is not something, this seems kind of maybe, to you, it might sound like, well, that's the way television is. People speak the way, they use slang and they talk with a dialect, and that's what you're used to because you watch TV, and that's how people act. And good actors imitate real life. But that's not the way books were written. That's not the way literature was constructed. The way that writing was done was to be as sophisticated and high level and upper class as possible. You were supposed to demonstrate your education. And you might notice, I do the same thing. Like in this book, the way I speak to you now is different than the way that the book is written. And that's because when I wrote the book, I sort of slid into my university educated writing style. And that's how I wrote the book. So the book is more difficult to understand than the video lectures like I'm making right now. But what Mark Twain was able to do was to make dialogue and write the way that people actually spoke. So there was a lot of criticism, against his writing style because they were saying that he's destroying the English language. Like, stupid, you're writing the way, I shouldn't say stupid people, ignorant people, uneducated people speak. You're putting that into your book and making people you're just going to lower the level of the English language when you do that. But that's not what he believed. He believed that he should make the characters realistic, that Huckleberry Finn would speak like this. He wouldn't sound like, a rich kid that was educated in a Gangnam Academy. He would speak like he was born on the Mississippi and that he'd never gone to school, or that he went to school and never paid attention and made friends with an escaped slave African-American man named Jim. And he would speak like an African-American slave who never had a proper education at a private school or didn't know how to read, and that's the way they would talk to each other, and that's what he did. He's known as the father of American literature because he sort of put literature down a different path. He was very intelligent. We would probably call him racist if he was walking around today and you had a conversation with him. You'd probably think he was shockingly racist, but for his day and age, he was probably progressive. That's one of the things you have to understand about 20th century and 19th century America. We're in the 21st century now, and that if you want to read exactly how the culture, was represented and how people behaved, you would be insulted and offended by a lot of the behavior and the ideas that people had hundreds of years ago. Not even hundreds of years ago. That's the problem. It's that we're talking about 150 years ago with Mark Twain, but some of these things are still ongoing. When you talk about slavery and you talk about the treatment of Native people, that's the reason why I've included this in our study of American culture, is because it continues to be a problem. So that's the end of chapter 5, and tomorrow you do have a quiz, so please, I'm going to send out an email as one of our students suggested. I'm going to send out an email right at 10 o'clock in case you have some sort of issue with going through the CNU portal. But basically, you've got 10 minutes to answer all the questions about chapter 5. It's imperialism, industrialization, and Victorian England, plus Mark Twain. Okay? So make sure you watch this lecture, get some sleep, prepare yourself, and do a good job at the quiz. And next week we'll talk about the American Civil War, and then we'll move into the 20th century, which hopefully some people have said, well, when are we ever going to get to the stuff that I'm familiar with? Next week we're going to get into television, Hollywood, and the other things that are related, more closely to our present day culture. Thank you for listening, and have a good day. Good luck on the quiz tomorrow, and I'll see you again on the weekend when I record the next lecture. Have a good day.